Good morning, everyone. Happy Monday. Good morning. Good morning. I will give some folks an opportunity to connect. Okay. Good morning, everyone. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Dr. Sarissa Hugie. I am a psychiatric mental health nurse practitioner, and every Monday I've been coming on and providing tips about mental health, all things mental health. We previously were in an emotional wellness series, and we've kind of shifted our focus a little bit to address some of those thoughts that could be driving your emotional state. So last week we talked about the connections between our thoughts and emotions, and really how this connection ultimately drives our behavior. And the reality of this, and I cannot stress this enough, is that our mental health impacts the course of our entire lives. So my hope is that if we begin paying attention to our emotional states, we can begin to source the thoughts that are driving these feelings. So last week we took the time to unpack 7 cognitive distortions, and we're going to continue in that vein because remember, cognitive distortions are the thought patterns that really foster unhealthy emotional states and ways of coping. So I want to remind you, though, that mental health and wellness is a lifelong journey, and really we are all a work in progress, and there's always hope. So my goal is really to provide you with tools to be proactive about your mental health. Good morning, Dion. Thank you so much for joining. So without further ado, we will go ahead and jump right in to identifying or naming some cognitive distortions. So the first one I want to talk about this morning is called the Fallacy of Fairness. And with the Fallacy of Fairness, we sort of take the position of God in terms of thinking that we know what's fair. So, when things or circumstances don't necessarily line up with our ideal of fairness, then we can become resentful or hopeless, angry, because things are not going the way that we decide to measure those things. But the reality is, of course, that life is just simply not fair, and things will not always work out the way that we believe it should. So the fallacy of fairness is a cognitive distortion in which we, again, have this certain measuring stick or ruler that we're measuring people's actions against or certain scenarios against. And if it doesn't fit within that ruler and our measuring points, then it's not considered fair. Another cognitive distortion is blaming. And this one is, of course, very common because in blaming, we hold other people responsible for our emotional pain. And, while other people may have some responsibility in this, unfortunately, what this does is this takes the responsibility completely off of us. And we're unable to take personal responsibility for anything that happens in our lives. We're totally subject to what other people say and do. And the problem with this distortion is that it really leaves you powerless. It takes away your power. Good morning, Cheryl. Good morning, Judy. Good to see you all. Thanks so much for joining in. So the next cognitive distortion that we're going to talk about is the should. And this is very similar to the fallacy of fairness, but it's a little bit different in that you're looking at a set of rules that you believe should govern your actions and another person's actions. So these people should be doing this. I should be doing this according to these standards. So then we become upset when we feel like other people are violating that. And again, because we are fallible, we're not perfect, we also internalize a sense of shame and guilt when we violate our own rules. So this is the fallacy of should. The next cognitive distortion that we'll talk about this morning is emotional reasoning. And emotional reasoning is very dangerous because from this standpoint, we're saying, I feel this way, so then it absolutely must be true. And we know that feelings can be misleading. So we certainly have to be careful about this type of emotional reasoning simply because our emotions take over our logic entirely. So again, we have to be, proactive and paying attention to, whether or not this is an emotional reasoning rather than it's actually based on facts. Um, the next cognitive distortion that I want to talk about this morning is thinking that things will never change. And really, this cognitive distortion is deeply rooted in the past, because we're looking at the patterns in our lives and things that have happened, and we're saying that is never going to change. And so we're allowing the past to predict or dictate a future, and it does not have to. It does not have to. So when we think things will never change, then we will never really take any action to change those things in our lives. And again, this is another distortion that completely takes the responsibility off of us and puts it onto the circumstances or the situation. Things are never going to change, so I may as well never try. Very dangerous. The very last cognitive distortion that I want to talk about this morning is called labeling. And really, what labeling does is you look at a few negative characteristics about a person or a circumstance, and we make a universal statement or judgment about that person. And so it could be an insult. It could be called as simple as calling someone a loser, because they didn't do well in that area, or calling someone a jerk. But it also could be a very derogatory thing. We know this about, racism and prejudice, is that, some negative, one person does something negative, and we automatically label the entire group of people based on these negative stereotypes. So again, this is very dangerous because oftentimes everyone does not fit into the same category, or just because someone makes one bad choice or does something that we don't agree with, it doesn't mean that that person is completely hopeless, or that they're a loser or a jerk, or whatever it is that we label that person. So I just want to recap the cognitive distortions that we sort of talked about this morning. Good morning, Tracy. Thank you so much for joining. Just recapping the cognitive distortions that we talked about this morning: the fallacy of fairness, and that is becoming resentful and hopeless, really, when people are not measuring up to what we think is fair. Blaming is holding other people completely responsible for our emotional pain and not taking any personal responsibility. Should, the fallacy of should, really wanting people's actions to fall into a set of rules, as well as your own actions, and then either becoming upset when someone else violates those rules, or internalizing shame when you're not able to follow those rules. Emotional reasoning, essentially, if I feel this way, then it must be true. So the emotions are taking over your thinking entirely, thinking that things will never change. And this is the belief that the past will automatically predict the present or dictate the future. And again, this is a very hopeless way of thinking. And then last but not least, we talked about labeling, and that is really looking at a few negative characteristics and making a universal judgment about the person or even yourself. Okay, so and kind of want to transition here to talk about really having a balanced approach to emotional and mental wellness, because some people would argue that you should never ever follow your feelings. And this, in my opinion, professionally and personally, this is simply not a true statement, because there are times when we should be following our feelings. And I'll give some examples of that. I feel like being affectionate towards my husband, so therefore I act on those affections. Or I encounter a family that's struggling and I move with compassion and I decide to buy them groceries. Or I'm really passionate about a certain cause. I really have empathy for this cause, so I choose to volunteer for certain organizations. Good morning, Kiki. Thank you so much for joining in. Or if I have a negative sense that a relationship is toxic or dangerous, then I may feel the need to distance myself from the relationship. And so those are cases, both negative feelings and positive feelings, where we should follow our feelings. But really the key to mental and emotional wellness is to know when to follow your feelings and to know when not to follow your feelings. And this is very important because all feelings are real. All feelings are real, but sometimes they're based on a perception that may not be accurate, or acting on those feelings or not acting on those feelings may have significant consequences or repercussions. And so I want to give you a few examples of that. And I'm going to give you a positive feeling that you may not necessarily or you should not act on, and also a negative experience. So I'll give this example. You met someone in terms of a dating relationship, and you have these intense feelings, the sparks are flying, everything is wonderful. And, very early on, you believe that you should marry this person. Is this a feeling that you should act on right away? And you may be right. You may be right about these feelings and eventually marry this person, or you could later find out that the person is abusive or they lack integrity. Okay. Another example would be you're on a girls' trip and everybody's having a good time and you all decide to go to the mall. Well, prior to the trip, you've already had a budget for this trip, and you get to the mall and you see an item that costs $1,000, right? Maybe it's a Louis Vuitton purse or a pair of boots, whatever it is. This item is $1,000. So in the moment, you may feel excited and you may really want to purchase that item. However, acting on this feeling could have significant financial implications. It could affect your savings plan. It could cause you not to be able to pay a bill that's important or do something for your family. So that would be an instance where you should not follow your feeling. Another example would be your boss makes a comment or really upsets you or handles something in a way that you did not appreciate. Well, and you want to tell the boss a piece of your mind, or you want to make a sarcastic comment. Well, responding inappropriately to this could lead to you losing your employment or affecting your livelihood. So, an alternative response may be going to a friend or talking to someone else about how to address this appropriately, or if you need to address this at all. So, and the last example I'll give here would be, you're disappointed in your child's actions. And while this disappointment may be legitimate and reasonable, you must consider how to respond to this disappointment and how to communicate in a way that will foster improvement and growth in your child instead of discouraging them or causing them to internalize failure. So, one practice that I have specifically been using for a lot of years that's been really helpful for me is to refrain from responding or making decisions during the height of any negative or positive emotions. Because really the amygdala, which is the emotional center in your brain, is very primitive. Emotions, sometimes they're, automatic and they can catch us by surprise. So, while these emotions are based on thoughts and a perception of something, we may not always be able to identify those thoughts that are driving that emotional process in the moment. We may not be able to identify that. So we need time to come down and process the situation. And really, I'll tell you, this has saved me a lot of heartache in terms of making bad decisions that may have long-term repercussions. It's also helped save relationships, and it keeps you really from saying or doing something that you're not able to take back. It also, taking that step back and allowing time to process the emotions and not making a decision based on that state allows you time to determine the legitimacy of the emotional process and also to identify the true source of something. So is this buildup of emotion, based on a series of events that have happened, but it really started 2 months ago, and identifying that as being the true source? Or, is that person really going through a hard time? And so that's why they've been distanced. And it's not the fact that, they no longer want to be my friend or, have this relationship. So really determining the legitimacy of your response, is it reality? And as a result of you taking the time to process this either internally or with someone else or via journaling, then you may decide that it's not even worth it. It's not something that you need to address. You can let it go. Or you may decide that you need to have a conversation with the person or the group, or you may decide that it's something that you need to change about the way that you're perceiving this or the way that you're responding. So, it certainly is a process. And as I often say, emotional and mental wellness is really a lifelong journey. And my goal is for us to be paying attention to our mental health, paying attention to our emotions, so that we can manage them appropriately, so that we can heal from past hurts, so that we can flourish in every aspect of our lives, and be connected to other people because we are connected and in tune with ourselves. So thank you so much for joining me on this Mental Health Monday. And I'm excited because next week we'll actually get into some exercises about how we're going to overcome these cognitive distortions. And I hope that you have found this talk helpful. If you have any questions, you can certainly leave them in the comments, or if you have any comments about anything, I'm happy to help and be a resource for you all. So again, thank you so much for joining in and tuning in on this Mental Health Monday. I see Ashley has joined us and Pam. So thank you all for tuning in as well. And you have a great day.